How true is the story of Apple starting up in a garage? Or the one about Steve Jobs throwing an iPod prototype into a fish tank? And what were the big mistakes Apple stumbled through to become the company we know today? I'm Divya Gopalan, and on Connected on Taiwan Plus, we'll be busting through the myths and mystery surrounding the world's most valuable company with David Pogue, the author of one of the most definitive books ever written about Apple. Apple's customer base has grown to nearly 2 billion since it was founded 50 years ago. And to understand how it got there and what's in store for the future, I am joined from New York by David Pogue. He is one of the most prolific writers of Apple and the author of Apple, the First 50 Years, and also a 7-time Emmy-winning correspondent for CBS Sunday Morning. David, great to have you on the show. I'm going to launch right in. What made you write this book, Apple, the First 50 Years? And what would you say was the biggest hurdle to getting to the last page, which is around 550?
You know, I've been covering Apple for 40 of its 50 years. I started writing about Apple when I was still in college. So it's a topic dear to my heart. I couldn't do this with any other company. And it also happens that this company has an amazing story with fantastic characters. I mean, who is a better main character than Steve Jobs? And then who has a better story arc than Apple, which was a rise, a fall, 6 weeks away from bankruptcy, and then a rise again to become the biggest company in the world. So I would say the hardest part was not finding people to interview for the first 35 years. But finding people to interview for the last 15 is very difficult, because most of them are still at Apple. And Apple has a rule: they do not allow current employees to speak to journalists. So it was months of negotiation. I did not want Apple to have editorial control over the book, but I did want them to grant me interviews and access to their archives. In the end, they agreed, and I'm very lucky, because otherwise the last 200 pages of the book would have been blank.
Right. So I understand the book is now also in Chinese. Tell us a little bit about that, and also the research process that you had to get to the final pages.
Yes, the Taiwanese edition is the very first foreign edition to be published. It's published by Commonwealth Publishing. It should be out any day now. And they've been incredible collaborators. Every step of the way, this publisher has conferred with me about changes or the title or other aspects of the book. I feel very much a part of this edition. So the research was 150 interviews. I spent 2 years on it, and most people were really thrilled to be interviewed. A lot of these guys are old now, you know, the people who created the original Macintosh, the original iPod, and I could just see it in their eyes that they felt very strongly about having the record set right, having this one final book that told the story correctly and corrected a lot of the myths and errors that had been kicking around.
I'm glad you brought that up, because we are going to be doing a bit of myth busting and setting that record right. But before that, you said you've been covering Apple for about 40 years. What kind of interactions did you have with Steve Jobs?
For 13 years, I was the technology columnist for the New York Times. And during those 13 years, we were granted 20 minutes with Jobs twice a year. So whenever he would have an announcement of a new product, they would let a few journalists have individual meetings with him. I wouldn't say he was a friend or that I really got to know him. Those meetings were under watch by PR people and very much on message. But I will say also that Steve Jobs had no problem calling me at home when he did or didn't like something that I had written. So that was a big part of those 13 years. He would call to scream at me with, very bad language, or in some cases, praise me or say he loved something that I wrote. other CEO in the world does that.
Basically treating you like an employee. I want to go through some of this, some of the points you made at the start of the book where it says origins about Steve Jobs. One was he was not Apple's first CEO, nor its second, third, or fourth. He did not originate the name Macintosh. In fact, he forced out the man who did. Jobs never fired anyone. He just met in the elevator. And he didn't write Think Different ad. So why do you think he was such a force of nature within Apple and has pretty much became synonymous with Apple?
I mean, really, Apple was his company. And what I mean by that is the entire company existed to execute his ideas. I can't
he was
think of
only
any other...
with the company about 25 years of the 50 years?
That's right. That's right. He was there for 9 years at the beginning, and then he was forced out in 1985, gone for 11 years, and then he came back in 1997, and that was the second coming of Apple. That was the iMac, the iPod, the iPad, the iPhone, iMovie, iPhoto, and so on. That was the golden age. And then he died in 2011. So, yeah, Jobs was the CEO for less than half of Apple's time.
And sorry, before I interrupted you, you were saying how he was the brains or a certain... Tell us what kind of force he was for the company.
Especially in the early days, he was, I mean, some people say abusive. He would rip you apart if he didn't think you were doing your best work. He often said, I'm not doing it to be cruel. I'm just doing it because I know that you can do better work. And many of the employees I spoke to admitted that he was right. So he would say, Steve, you just can't do what you're asking with this little memory. And then he would scream at them. And then that weekend they'd go home and say, well, maybe if I did this. And they would come up with a way to do it. So there are different takes on whether he just had a mean streak or whether he genuinely was interested and driven to make the best product by the best company in the world. And if he felt that you were slowing him down, he would just run you over.
You've debunked a few of the myths in this book, but tell us about some of them, particularly the one about the iPod and the fish tank, and the fact that they started in a garage.
Yeah, that's right. Apple did not start in a garage. I can't tell you how much a part of the Apple story that is, but it isn't true. Apple started at HP, Hewlett-Packard, when Woz, this very shy, very lovable, very generous man, wanted to create a computer for himself. Remember, in 1976, individuals did not own computers. It was for corporations and governments. That was it. But he made this circuit board that we now call the Apple I. He did that work at his desk at HP, where he was a calculator designer. And it was this friend of his, Steve Jobs, 4 years younger, who said, we should sell that. And that was really the beginning of Apple. But yeah, the myths are fantastic. They've been passed down from book author to book author through the years of Apple books. And nobody ever stops to ask if they're true. And one of the best is Steve Jobs wanted the iPod to be as small as possible. So he kept driving his engineers and his designers to make it smaller. Finally, they brought him a prototype. They said, Steve, this is as small as it gets. And he looked at it. He walked over to the corporate fish tank and dropped the iPod into the water. Air bubbles came up. And he said, see those air bubbles? That means there's still space in there. Get rid of it. What a great story. Not true. Never happened.
Not true.
No.
But it's a great story, as you said.
Such a great story.
And Apple's story is also a great story. That incredible turnaround from hitting bad times. Tell us how bad those bad times were. And what did Steve Jobs do to make that comeback, or Apple's comeback?
I'm glad you asked that, because this is, I challenge anyone to think of a greater company turnaround in history. In the 11 years that Jobs was gone, Apple devolved into redundancy and fiefdoms and duplication. They had 50 different Mac models. Nobody could tell them apart. They had 12 ad agencies all with different ad messages, some that conflicted. In fact, my favorite story during this time is a day when two Apple lawyers showed up in court to sue each other. I mean, it had just gotten so ridiculous.
You can't make it up.
So Steve Jobs, no, it's true. So Jobs came in, he fired the entire board, he fired all 12 ad agencies, he canceled all 50 math models. He said, we're going to come up with four Macs, that's it. 2 laptops, 2 desktops, and that way we can have our best engineers on every product. And in place of all those ads, he said we're going to have one ad, and it was the Think Different ad. You know, here's to the crazy ones that won every award and really changed how people felt about Apple inside the company too, because people were very demoralized at the time. They thought Apple was a dying entity, and here was a guy who thought that they still had a soul and could still do good work.
But even after he came, there were some massive flops of products. Can you tell us about those and how they moved on from those?
Yeah, I mean, there were some great stories, both from the early days, like who's ever heard of the Apple III? This was the successor of the Apple II that was supposed to be the big business computer. It overheated so much, this is true, Apple issued an alert to owners of the Apple III that if they found the computer shutting off suddenly, it was because internally the heat was causing contacts to expand and to push the circuit board off its posts. So the instructions were to lift the computer 3 inches off the desk and drop it. And this would reseat the circuit board onto the posts and it would work again. They literally offered that advice. Nobody worked with that computer. It was a failure. The Lisa was a failure. And even in recent years, I mean, Tim Cook is now the CEO. Under his watch, they did the Apple Watch, which was a hit, and the AirPods, which are, of course, a hit. They did the Vision Pro, though, the goggles, which are very technologically advanced but did not sell well. And they spent 10 years and $10 billion on the Apple car, which I really would have loved. I mean, it was said to be an electric, completely self-driving car, no steering wheel, no pedals, 4 reclining leather seats that faced each other, just a beautiful machine with the world's greatest sound system, but they could never quite get the self-driving to work perfectly. So in 2024, they canceled it.
You mentioned circuit boards earlier when it came to the Apple III, but the attention Apple gave to circuit boards, even down to the design of circuit boards, was baffling given the fact that most people would not see it. Can you give us a sense of this whole idea of design, whether it was right in front of your face or behind the scenes, and how important that was to how Apple's evolved?
It's absolutely true. Jobs would look at the circuit board or other elements that no one would ever see and demand that it be redesigned to be more attractive. And if you look at the internals of things like the watch or the phone or the laptop, they are beautiful inside. And the reason for this, I interviewed Johnny Ive, who's the famous designer of the iMac and the iPhone, and he said, you can sense care even if you can't see care. You'll know somebody really sweated over every element. And I think that's really what distinguishes Apple from other companies.
And speaking of Johnny Ive's team, they had a reputation for being somewhat rebellious, and there was a wild all-night party of sorts. Can you tell us, can you give us the scoop on that?
I mean, Apple kind of came out of the 60s counterculture, right? The early Apple was hippies. I mean, Steve Jobs himself, as a younger man, he did not wear shoes. He did not cut his hair. He did not bathe. I mean, the one thing you hear about people knew him when he was young was that he stank. That improved over time. But I do think that counterculture rebellion is an important ingredient in what makes Apple Apple. I mean, the very idea that Jobs had of making the Apple II a beautiful, sculpted plastic enclosure. I mean, computers were not plastic in 1976. Computers were metal. They were industrial equipment. They were considered tools. And they didn't have monitors or keyboards. They had switches or punch cards. So all of this was kind of radical for Jobs to say, no, it should be beautiful. It should have smooth, curved lines. And that persists to this day. Apple constantly believes, after 50 years, in the same philosophy on which it was founded, which is we take ugly, complicated, but powerful technology, we make it beautiful and joyous to use. And that's still what Apple is doing.
Okay, so let's talk about closer to modern times here. The Tim Cook era. What quiet move or story surprised you most about how he has evolved Steve Jobs' legacy?
I mean, the really amazing thing is that Steve Jobs chose Tim Cook to be his successor. I mean, these two guys could not be more different. Jobs was dramatic and loud and passionate, and he was an idea man. He was just never stopped thinking of new ideas, new products. Tim Cook is shy, introverted, quiet, never raises his voice, and by his own admission, he is not a product guy. He is a logistics man, a supply chain, a costs and finances guy. So how did Jobs know that this would be the right man to take Apple into the future? I mean, under Tim Cook, Apple's revenues and profits have gone up by 4 times. Its head count is up 3 times, and its stock price is up like 10 times. Under Tim Cook, this not an idea man. So it's really amazing that Jobs saw what he saw in Tim Cook.
The revolutionary era of Apple is over. What did you mean by that? And does that mean that Apple's unlikely to see any more iPod moments?
I think that the era of every 3 years, there's a new iMac, iPod, iPhone, that thing that Steve Jobs did every 3 years, that does seem to be over. But that might be because the era of, let's put it this way, Steve Jobs came along at an amazing time, right? He came along right when advanced Chinese manufacturing was coming along, when miniaturization from Taiwan was taking hold, when the public was getting used to having technology in their lives, in their hands. Those are 3 big forces that happened during the Steve Jobs years. If he had lived, would he have been able to keep up that pace of something new and revolutionary every 3 years? We don't know. What we do know is that no other company has come up with anything as big as the iPhone either. But Apple has been quietly doing its own revolution in different ways. Services, that was a big Tim Cook thing. Silicon, Apple is now designing its own chips, which, thanks to TSMC, have been low power in terms of battery, but high power in terms of horsepower. And that's really revolutionary in its own way. And then the third way that Tim Cook has really revolutionized things, kind of snuck up on us, that Apple has become a medical company. So the watch now can determine, atrial fibrillation and high blood pressure and sleep apnea and a host of other things. It'll save lives by the hundreds of thousands.
Right. Siri was revolutionary, and perhaps some of the earliest forms of AI that we saw, but Apple since then has not really made much progress when it comes to AI. And now it's teaming up with Google. Can you tell us about that trajectory?
It is true. Apple missed the generative AI wave. There's no question about it. It caught them by surprise. There have been turnover of executives. There have been changes of strategy. I think they now have a good strategy. They've teamed up with Google, as you say, to provide the underpinnings of a new, better Siri. This June, they say, they will be announcing some major AI announcements. I think what it's going to be is what they demonstrated 2 years ago that we still don't have yet, which is a Siri that knows your messages and your email and your files. So you could say in this demonstration, what time do I need to leave to pick up my mom? Now, the phone knows from your email that your mother is coming for the holidays, from what flight she's on. It knows what the air traffic is like, whether the plane will be late, and it knows what the road traffic will be like, and it'll just say, you need to leave at 1:30. I mean, that's useful. That would be really cool. So I suspect that's what we're going to get. To be fair to Apple, Apple does not usually produce products that half work, that sort of work. And as we all know, ChatGPT and Gemini and Microsoft's Copilot, they give you wrong answers about 28% of the time. They just make stuff up. I mean, is that what we want from our Apple products, to have it sort of work most of the time? I think it's a tough spot for Apple to be in, because everybody wants AI, but nobody wants the wrong answers.
You're right. People, Apple's users, myself included, have come to expect certain things from Apple. But one of those things that Apple does provide, and has always been part of their mantra, is about privacy and keeping people's data private. And you use your Apple and you're secure. But given that they're teaming up with Google and will be using the cloud, Google's cloud too, for their version of AI, how much of a compromise will that be for Apple consumers?
It's a very important question. Apple does the AI processing it can right on the phone, so it stays private there. But for more complicated queries, it does have to send those off to a data server somewhere. And this is a little bit technical and wonky, but I think it's cool. So Apple developed something called the private cloud computer, which means when you send a query off to a data center, it gives you the answer, sends it back, and then erases both your question and your answer. And of course, we're all like, oh, sure it does. We're supposed to believe you. So Apple said, for the first time in corporate history, yes, believe us, because you can come and inspect the code. Rivals can come, researchers can come. It has opened up this server farm for inspection by anybody. And there's a bounty program. If you find that Apple is not doing what it says it does, they will pay you up to $1 million. So when they struck this deal with Google, they insisted that Google abide by the same rules. So Google will be forced to do the same deleting of your query and your answer to maintain your privacy in order to get that deal from Apple.
David, I want to go back to one of the points you made earlier about Apple's partnership with TSMC and other Taiwanese chip makers or providers. Can you explain how that relationship started?
I will say one of the things that bothers me a little bit by Apple saying we're very happy to make our own silicon now, and for everybody in the press who says once Apple started making its own chips, it turned the company around. Apple doesn't make its own chips. As everybody in Taiwan knows, it's TSMC making Apple's chips. And I don't know of many other companies who could. It's really advanced chip making at a tiny, tiny scale. Apple designs the chips, but TSMC makes them. So, it is unequivocal that without Taiwan's participation, Apple would not have been able to do this silicon revolution.
So as far as you can see, and from the Apple people you've spoken to, it's a relationship that's set to continue for the foreseeable future, would you say?
Absolutely. Not only because Apple loves the work it gets from TSMC, but also where else would Apple go? I mean, literally the most advanced semiconductors in the world come out of TSMC.
We're just about wrapping up here, David, but before you go, can you tell us perhaps one thing in the course of your research on Apple that you learned writing this book that really surprised you?
Yeah, I can. I think that the grand takeaway that I didn't really realize, every company says we strive for excellence, right? Everybody says that. But man, when you interview these people who are at Apple, it is a very intense place to work, and they really believe it. And I'll just give you one quick example. When they were developing Face ID that unlocks the phone with your face, they wanted to make sure that it would work perfectly on every face in the world. So they would take the prototype to twins conferences to see if your twin could fool it. They wanted to make sure that creative facial hair wouldn't fool it. So they took it to Harley-Davidson motorcycle rallies and tried it on the guys there. They took it to sub-Saharan Africa to try on tribesmen's faces, which have a different facial structure from, for example, European descent. They hired a Hollywood special effects company to make a set of hyper-realistic heads, face masks, to see if a mask could fool it. And there's a great story about the guy in the mailroom who opened that box from Hollywood and saw all these heads staring out at him. But I mean, they really do walk the walk. They go the 11th extra mile for excellence. And I think it's what has made Apple capable of surviving and thriving for 50 years.
And you think it can survive and thrive for another 50?
I do. At this point, Apple has 2.5 billion customers. That's 31% of the global population. I think that gives Apple a long cushion, a long runway for it to figure out what the next big thing is. I don't think those customers are going to be leaving anytime soon.
David, what a pleasure to talk to you and to get the inside scoop from a very unique viewpoint perspective. David Pogue, author of Apple, the First 50 Years. Thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you. It was a pleasure of mine.
And to our viewers, it has been good to have your company. If you'd like more tech and business stories from Taiwan, follow us on our socials where we keep you informed, engaged, and connected.